What's going on YouTube? It's Pilot Flame and I am back again with another video. Today we're talking Gunbreaker and all the things that we can see from it in Final Fantasy XIV's next expansion, Shadowbringers. First off, we're going to look at what its main basic 1-2-3 combo is, which is Keen Edge into Brutal Shell into Solid Barrel. This combo gets you a shield with also a cure potency on Brutal Shell's second part of the combo, which has a duration of 10 seconds for the shield. It's a very small shield. It's quite useful. It allows you to sustain back up. That shield can also be passed on as well in duplicate with a party member of your choosing with one of their skills, which we will get onto later. And Solid Barrel is the third part of the combo, which adds a cartridge to your powder gauge. This is part of the job gauge for Gunbreaker, where you can hold up to 2 cartridges of max, and also the orangey, goldy looking icon in the center is just basically your tank stance. What do you do with these cartridges? Well, you have a second tier combo, which the first part of it activates when using a cartridge called Gnashing Fang, which goes into Savage Claw and then finishes off with Wicked Talon. So the Gnashing Fang requires 1 cartridge charge and grants you an off GCD called Ready to Rip. Savage Claw grants you an off GCD buff Ready to Tear, and an additional effect for Wicked Talon, Ready to Gouge. So basically you have an ability called Continuation, which basically allows you to do the off GCD's Jugular Rip, Abdomen Tear, and Eye Gouge, which is all on the same button. So basically you do Gnashing Fang into Jugular Rip, Savage Claw into Abdomen Tear, Wicked Talon into Eye Gouge just within the next 10 seconds. The reason you have to do Jugular Rip and Abdomen Tear immediately after Gnashing Fang and Savage Claw respectively is because they're on the same ability, which will then overwrite the other one. Nextly, we're going to talk about what the AoE rotation is for the Gunbreaker. So we have an ability which is just Demon Slice, which then combos into Demon Slaughter, which adds a cartridge to your powder keg. 2-part combo, much like the other tanks. And lastly, they have a GCD which is called Faded Circle, which basically consumes a cartridge and deals a lot more damage. So basically, in a sense, it's a 3-part combo. So you're going to be doing Demon Slice into Demon Slaughter into a Faded Circle. And these are in an area around the Gunbreaker within a 5-yard radius. And the Faded Circle costs exactly 1 cartridge. You have Lightning Shot, which is basically just your pull mechanic. In terms of off GCDs, they have an ability called Danger Zone, which is an instant cast 30-second recast off GCD, which upgrades to Blasting Zone at level 80, which basically doubles its potency for the time being. Rough Divide is their Gap Closer, which has a maximum of 2 charges with a 30-second recharge timer. Basically functions exactly the same as Paladin's one, which we'll get to in the next video. And then they have Burst Strike, which is a 450 potency weapon skill that consumes a cartridge, which you can be used basically outside of the phase of using your Gnashing Fang combo, which does have a recast timer of what seems to be 35 seconds. Now, I don't know if they're going to be changing this recast timer at all, but basically you can only use this once every 35 seconds, which means that you have to use Burst Strike in the times that you don't have the ability to use Gnashing Fang. Nextly, we're going to take a look at the Gunbreaker's dodge, which they have 2 of, one of which is on the GCD. It's not a very strong dot, initial potency of 100 with a potency of 50 over 15 seconds, so that works out to be 350 if my math is correct, but it is on the GCD, so it's not the greatest. So you typically only want to be using under some type of buff window or your own power window, which we'll get to in a bit. And then you have Bow Shock, which is basically just Circle of Scorn for Paladin as well. 200 potency on nearby enemies with the damage over time of 90 potency over 15 seconds, which works out to be a 650 potency dot, which is pretty strong. In terms of those utilities, Royal Guard, as we mentioned, is the icon shown on the job meter, which basically does the exact same thing as Defiance and all the other tank stances, which we mentioned before, which just increases your enmity. Then we have your steroid, as it were, which is No Mercy, which is a 60-second CD, which increases all damage dealt by 10% for 20 seconds. I feel this is where they could potentially buff Gunbreaker, considering its potencies are quite low, which you can see in the link below, where it shows all the different potency per second over a 60-second window for the jobs based on the tooltips that we've been given. In terms of Gunbreaker's off-tanking utility, you have Aurora, which is basically regen from White Mage, which you can cast on any member of the party. So it's good for when you're tanking in order to give yourself a little bit extra sustain. It's also good for when you're off-tanking so that you can heal up your go tank. Heart of Stone is a off GCD that is on a 25-second recast time with a 7-second duration, which reduces damage taken by a party member or self by 15%. When targeting a party member while under the effect of Brutal Shell, it also grants them that shield as well, which is very good for when you're off tanking or having to take split busters, which I assume we're probably going to see a lot more of based on the amount of off tanking utility that a lot of the tanks have been given. They've also been given a self cooldown in Camouflage, which is a 90-second recast time. Increases your parry rate by 50% while reducing damage taken by 10%. So typically you want to pair this with something, most likely Heart of Stone, to make sure you keep yourself well off. So it's not as good as a Rampart, but it is still something there. The other cooldown for raid utility-wise is you have Heart of Light, which is reduces damage taken by self and nearby party members by 15% for 15 seconds on a 90-second recast timer. This cooldown is absolutely amazing. It's insane raid utility, can be used selfishly as well, and especially with its duration being 15 seconds, you could potentially pair it with the latter half of the cast of a tank buster into a raid-wide AoE. So it's super cool in that regard. Nebula is basically their Sentinel, their Shadow Wall, their Vengeance. You do 120-second recast time, reducing damage by 30% over a 10-second duration. And then you have a 90-second cooldown Bloodfest, which basically adds 2 cartridges to your powder gauge instantly. Lastly, they have for defensives their Invuln. So it's same recast as Hallowed Ground on 7 minutes. It reduces your HP to 1 and then renders you impervious to most attacks for a total of 8 seconds. So this is probably the second worst, if not the worst, Invuln, with Home Gang being first, Hallowed Ground being second, and this and Living Dead probably being third and fourth. You can kind of pick and choose. With this one, at least you can get healed while you're impervious to most attacks. But it does intentionally drop your HP to 1. I can see this being on a 6-minute CD and still being very good, but it's not the greatest, but it is still an Invuln nonetheless. In terms of overall, what can we see from the Gunbreaker? Really fun gameplay. It looks like it's doing a lot of different things at various different points in the fight. It just is lacking a bit of potency from what we can tell on paper. In terms of its traits, it still gets the same tank mastery. It gets basically its cartridge gauge. It gets Brutal Shell, which is basically a trait that is added onto your Brutal Shell combo. And your level 80 trait is Danger Zone, being up to Blasting Zone. So in terms of it being underwhelming, what would I like to see before the expansion, or at least in the weeks during the early access and before the raid tier? I would like to see the Gnashing Fang combo have its recast time reduced. I don't think it actually needs a recast time of any sort, but if you wanted to reduce that, that would be good, or you could potentially up its potency as well. I can also see a vouch for upping the potency on the Jugular Rip, Abdomen Tear, Eye Gouge off GCDs. That would also be something. Burst Strike probably needs to be a bit more potency, considering it consumes a cartridge for only being 450 potency, which isn't that much, especially for something that is consuming effectively half your resource gauge. Another thing that they could potentially do is make No Mercy a higher percentage damage dealt while keeping the same duration, because I think 10% is a bit weak, considering if you look at Fight or Flight, which is 25% increased physical damage for 25 seconds, and Requisite being 50% increased potency on your magic attacks for effectively 10 seconds. Whereas Warrior has just basically a 10% damage up all the time by just keeping up Storm's Eye. And Dark Knight is going to have its Dark Side, which we are assuming is 10% based on the numbers that we've been getting. But overall, looking like a really fun job. I can definitely see this being picked up by a lot of players, whether it being good or bad initially. It just looks like a lot of fun to play. It looks like it's doing a lot of different things, and given the right tuning, I can see this being a very fun, very strong job going into the next expansion. So for now, it's a good night for me, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.